You were telling a little bit about LeRoy Schweitzer.
Yeah, so LeRoy was quite the constitutionalist, and he knew a lot about political parties, political things happening, a lot about the banking foundations, what they had done. My dad and I decided to go up to Montana to visit him and go through his program. He taught quite a bit, not just on Constitution and freedom and that kind of thing, but a lot of biblical history.
America is a nation. It happens to be the nation of Manasseh. That's why the founding fathers created the symbol that they did. It's on your Federal Reserve note to this day, on the $1 bill anyway. For the eagle with the cloud of Israel above it with all the signals of 13. We are the tribe of Manasseh, prophesied in the Bible. The founding fathers knew it. And if you want some history on it, it's this book here, The Christian History of the Constitution of the United States of America.
Which was really good because a lot of biblical history, you didn't get that kind of Baptist type realm with it, but he knew both sides. He really knew a lot. So we went up, we visited with him, and there was even a lady there, and she had a notebook that told about how she had put a lot of judges out of office, because a lot of judges break their oath of office and they do a lot of criminal acts, and they have made vows with IRS, they've made, with all different things, and so when they're exposed, she was taking them down. And so there was a lot of different people, very intelligent people, that had congregated up here in his little house, and he had taught a lot of different. That's where I first learned about mixing cotton and wool, like in the Bible it tells not to. And so he was really dedicated to old biblical principles. So he had found a secret banker's book about actually how they move money transaction-wise through counter checks or through different types of checks. And they thought they would experiment on how this went. They thought, well, hey, if it works for them, maybe we could try it. And so they decided, well, let's pay them back double. There's some biblical principle about a debt and paying back double, and so they'd basically create the money, and then they would actually send money back to the bank. So the bank would get half, and we'd get half or double or however it went.
It's what's known in the codes as peculiar jurisdiction. The word peculiar there meaning separate. Our law has always been separate. It's in the Old Testament. In Amos, you can read a quote there, and I use it for our Benton quite a bit. It's an easy one to understand. It's pretty much correct. Amos 5:14 and 15. And it says in there, hate evil and love the good. Establish justice in your law courts. Perhaps the Lord of hosts will be merciful to the fragments of Joseph.
And so it was an interesting idea, and he made out, to me, he made out a counter check for my truck, my semi-truck, and my house, and some other things. And so there was one gentleman in the class, and he made some different checks, and he got a bunch, and he went and paid his house off and several things.
And this was successful. They actually paid the house off.
It was actually working. It did very well. And I didn't feel comfortable with it for some reason. Something told me to be very careful. And it was only like 2 weeks later. So there were people who'd gone through the program before us that it was working for. But then 2 weeks after this, the FBI raided this part of Montana, and at their house, they called it a compound.
And he wasn't with the Montana Freemen. He'd sort of done his own thing.
He was part of them at one time, but then he kind of broke off on his own and started his own little chapter or whatever.
Law enforcement officers haul fugitive Freemen to jail cells in Billings. In custody are 56-year-old LeRoy Schweitzer. He's regarded by some people as the leader of the Freemen.
They call themselves the, quote, Freemen. They don't obey laws, but tonight they're surrounded by officers of the law. Hundreds of federal peace officers and police are laying siege to a heavily armed compound in Montana.
And so he had studied this out very well. Like I said, he's a very intelligent individual. And then I guess the FBI came and they threatened him, and then they came and surrounded his place. Now he made the statement that the FBI or any government agency, because of how he put his land or his property into a I don't know what it was, some sort of a non-government type entity, and so they never did step on his property.
In Justice Township, a conservator of the peace. I'm a justice of peace. I'm a justice of the peace. We are the titles of nobility in America. We're the kings.
They couldn't trespass. They couldn't come on, but they were there for like a month, sending sound waves and doing all this weird stuff. And finally, they ran out of food storage and whatever, and they finally came out. And so they captured these guys and they threw them in jail. And then not long after that, my dad had contacted Schweitzer's daughter, and then she sent him there was another pastor that had wrote a little pamphlet on it about what happened. And she said that when she got in, the FBI had just literally beat him to a pulp. I mean, he had black eyes, broken bones. I mean, it was just awful.
You said fractured forehead.
Yeah, they hit him in the head or did a bunch of other stuff. It was pretty messed up. And so he did not recover from those and eventually died, which really upset my dad. He worked for the government. He'd seen some of the corruption go on.
This demonstration of federal force laying siege to this farmhouse with 18 alleged check writers is a bit of overkill.
And so, and in fact, what's interesting about those was that there was a Salt Lake judge that was getting pressure from the government, the bankers, I guess, that he should shut down these counter checks. And so Dad was called in as an expert witness, and they asked the questions and what happened, and Dad was saying they're valid. I mean, there's no, you can say that they're not, but they are. And so then the judge pulled him back in the back and said, what do I do? I mean, they're real, but I got to stop it, and you got to do this, and what would you do, Ogden? And he goes, well, I'd say, okay, I'm going to slap your hands, don't do it anymore, and then just say, just leave it at that. Don't make a big deal out of it, otherwise you'll get papers and so at this point, just say, okay, well, you did it, and it was accurate, but now they don't want those to happen anymore. And so this guy got off with, paying off $1 million house and some other stuff. And so it proves the validity that bankers do use different types of counter checks and different things, and how it all works.
So basically, banking practices that don't apply to or don't want to apply to the everyday
citizen.
And in terms of the other Montana Freemen, have any of those men died in jail or been murdered?
Not that I know of. No, they pretty much left them alone. They didn't cross any lines that were deep. Anytime you're deep into somebody's pocketbook, they don't like that.
Would you say that LeRoy Schweitzer was kind of the ideologue of the Freemen and went and did his own thing?
Could be. Yeah, he kind of tried to do. I think LeRoy was a little bit. He felt like nothing could happen to him, and why I'm making this video is things can happen to you. You got to be careful.
The story of LeRoy Schweitzer is very difficult to pin down because as soon as he was beaten half to death by the FBI and taken into custody, the media chose to focus more heavily on the people who chose to stay at his ranch. Now, according to Kevin, and according to what little information I've been able to find, Schweitzer didn't consider himself the leader of the Montana Freemen per se. He considered himself a simple professor, an educator in biblical and constitutional law, and so at the time he was arrested and beaten nearly to death, 16 people were on his property, and they were already told by Schweitzer that the FBI was not legally allowed to enter that property, and when they raised their flag upside down over a trailer on the outskirts of his property, they saw that the FBI was not encroaching on them past the property line. Now, FBI and local law enforcement will say that this is because they already had a bungled operation at Waco and then another one at Ruby Ridge, and they did not want any more bloodshed on their hands, so they decided to just take a backseat approach. Of course, they had a show of force. They lined up tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they brought in helicopters, but they didn't actually approach the property. And so days turn into weeks, turn into months, and then eventually, 81 days later, this standoff ends peacefully, without any bloodshed. After his savage beating, he appears to have had some level of brain damage. Before they brought him in front of a judge, they wrapped him in chains and put a gag around him, and the short time that they took the gag off, he announced that he was a citizen of the country of Montana. Again, this is a man who's had his forehead caved in. Well, anyway, they gave him a 22-year sentence in Florence Supermax, same prison where you have Ted Kaczynski, where you have the Al Qaeda operatives that were caught after 9/11, where you have the shoe bomber, and then you've got this small town Montana guy teaching about constitutional law. And the years start rolling by, and by 2011, he's found unresponsive in his cell. And so ends the life of a man whom many would call a Montana patriot.